Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you here for tonight's event. Before we begin, I'd like to very briefly introduce our group hosting this event. So it's the Philosophy and Animal Welfare Studies Group, or PAWS, here at CBME, Center for Biomedical Ethics at NUS. So we're a collaborative community that brings together people from philosophy, bioethics, empirical science to explore the ethical dimensions of our treatment of animals. And we're sort of based globally, so we have people like Kanako Takae from Japan, Robert van der Sluis from Oxford, and a bunch of people here at NUS like Julian Savulescu and Brian Up. And so, yeah, part of our mission also is to support early and mid-career scholars to transition or start work on animal ethics and science relating to animal welfare. So if you're interested, please check out the Philosophy and Animal Welfare Studies Group, PAWS, on the CBME website. And please feel free to contact me or Fai, the person I'm going to introduce next. So Fai is a first-year PhD student at the Center for Biomedical Ethics. So he was a research associate for Peter Singer and also organized Peter Singer's China speaking tour in 2024. And he'll be the moderator for tonight's event. So I hope you all enjoy, and Fai, please.
So I will introduce Professor Peter Singer, which usually the way I begin is Professor Peter Singer doesn't need any introduction, but I guess this might be slightly different tonight, so I will go on with my introduction. So Professor Peter Singer has been bestowed the tag of the world's most influential living philosopher by journalists. He was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1946 and educated at the University of Melbourne and University of Oxford. After teaching in England, the United States and Australia, he was the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. He first became well-known internationally after the publication of Animal Liberation, which will be our subject this evening, obviously. He published that in 1975. Some of his other well-known books are Practical Ethics, The Expanding Circle, How Are We to Live, Rethinking Life and Death, The Life You Can Save, The Point of View of the Universe, co-authored with Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, Ethics in the Real World, and Why Vegan? So let's join me in welcoming Professor Singer onto the stage.
Thank you very much, Fai. Thank you, Faisal, also for hosting this event with PAWS. Thanks to the Center for Biomedical Ethics as well. That's why I'm in Singapore as a VK Raja visiting professor here, so it's really nice to be here in Singapore. And thanks to all of you for turning up. Good, so the ethics of our treatment of animals. As Fai just said, I published my first, certainly my book on this 50 years ago. Actually, 50 years ago exactly this month. It was published in September in the United States in 75. So it's nice to have a 50th anniversary of something you've written, and here's the original cover of the book. If you want to pick it up today, you get a different cover, and you do get a rather different book, because in 2023, I published Animal Liberation Now, which brings it up to date as it was then. Quite a lot of changes, talks a little bit about progress that the movement has made, and also, of course, the things that still need to be done, as we will see. So let me start with where we were in 1975. What was the generally accepted view about animals? And in fact, a lot of it is still around. There was a general view that it's good to be kind to animals. We ought to be kind to them. We ought not to be wantonly cruel, that is, cruelty sort of for its own sake or for fun, if you like, making an animal suffer for fun because you enjoy it or are bored and want to do something. That kind of cruelty was and is strongly condemned. But at the same time, it was accepted that animal interests could be overridden by human interests, and that even if they were rather minor human interests, let's say the desire to wear a fur coat, if you're in a colder climate than this one, I suppose, overrides the interests of the animals in not being trapped if they're wild animals and killed, or not being caged and reared for fur. So that idea really was hardly challenged at that point. And the idea that animals might have rights was something that wasn't really mentioned or suggested, but if it was, and although I'm not really arguing from the basis of rights because I'm a utilitarian, when Animal Liberation was published, a lot of people interpreted it as arguing for animal rights, and in a loose political sense of the term rights, that's not really wrong. And a lot of people just ridiculed the idea that animals have rights. Only humans have rights was the assumption. So those are the attitudes that were around. And what I would see as one of perhaps the largest abuse of animals by humans was not really mentioned. So, and by that I mean modern industrial animal raising, for short, factory farming, which you see here in this photo. This is the way in which more than 99% of all the chickens raised for meat, certainly in industrialized countries, are raised in enormous sheds like this in very crowded conditions. And I myself was not aware of this until 1970. So I was 24 years old. I was a well-educated person. I'd done a BA in Australia and a Master of Arts as well, and now I had gone to Oxford as a graduate student, just started my degree there, and I did not know that the animals I was then eating were spending their entire lives indoors, particularly the chickens and pigs, and veal calves, if I was eating veal. I had no awareness of that. It simply wasn't discussed. So even though there were some organisations working for animal welfare, in England, of course, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was a very ancient and honourable society going back to the early 19th century. But it did not try to expose the suffering of animals in factory farms. It was mostly focused on the suffering of cats and dogs and horses. It was very limited in its focus. So that was an issue that was not really discussed. And if you were to say, I don't eat animals or animal products, I'm a vegan, people would simply not have understood what you meant. The term was completely unknown at that point. There was a very small society in the United Kingdom called the Vegan Society, which had been founded a few years ago before that, but I think it had 300 members, and probably those were the majority of the vegans in the United Kingdom at the time, I would think. So people would ask these sorts of questions. Vegan, what does that mean? And they would say, well, can you even survive without eating animal products? Don't we all need to eat some animal products? That was a fairly widely held view at the time. Obviously false. There's quite a few vegans who are surviving quite well now. Okay, and there weren't any conferences really on animal ethics either, so I thought I would show you this rather ancient slide. You recognize the person on the far side there? I think it may well have been the first conference held on ethics in animals. It was held in Blacksburg, Virginia in 1979. And those of you who've studied animal ethics will know that as well as me. There's Tom Regan, who wrote a book called The Case for Animal Rights. Jim Rachels wrote a book called Created from Animals, about Darwin and animals. Stephen Clark wrote The Moral Status of Animals. And Henry Spira became a great campaigner for animals, maybe the most effective campaigner for animals in the last quarter of the 20th century. Okay, let's get to some philosophy, some theory. I want to introduce you to what is a key term in the discussion of how we treat animals. And that term is speciesism. I didn't invent it. It was coined by Richard Ryder, who was somebody who I got to know in Oxford and who was campaigning specifically against research on animals, and he used it in a little leaflet that I saw. but I popularized it in Animal Liberation, and I think that was how it became widely known. The point of the term, fairly obvious, is to make a parallel between things that most of us would acknowledge are wrong, namely racism and sexism, and something that they would not have thought of as wrong, and would not even, of course, know this word. But similarly, just as racism and sexism are about groups who are more powerful than others and who use that power in order to exploit and use in their own interests some of those who are outside their own group. So in the case of racists, if you think about the most extreme form of racism, the slave trade and slave-owning societies, obviously they regarded blacks as beings whose interest didn't really count, or didn't count nearly as much as the interests of Europeans, of whites, counted, and therefore we were justified in transporting them in horrendous conditions from Africa to the New World, and knowing that many of them would die because of those conditions on the voyage, and then sell them and make a profit from selling them for work on the plantations. And sexism, similarly, you get men who are more powerful than women and make women subservient to them to their own advantage. Maybe not always quite as brutally as the slave traders did, but nevertheless you get a similar pattern. And now think about our relations with animals. We too are clearly more powerful than them because of our technology, and we use them in ways that are really not all that different to the way the slave traders used Africans. We think of them as commodities. We buy and sell them. We transport them in pretty horrific conditions, and we also keep them in horrific conditions. You saw one slide already, and I'll show you some more before I'm finished. We also, as I said, we're ignoring their most important interests in order to satisfy very minor interests of ours, even if we object to wanton cruelty. So there are similarities. Now, I'm not saying that the parallel is exact, and I'm certainly not saying there are no differences between blacks and animals, or women and animals. That would obviously be a horrific thing to suggest. But in terms of the idea of one group being dominant over others and using its power, then I think that there is some similarity in that. Okay, so speciesism, this practice that I was talking about, has dominated Western society for more than 2,000 years, and there's a lot of history that I could go into, but I'm going to be very brief with this. Just mention the two roots of this tradition. One of them is in the Hebrew scriptures, in particular the book of Genesis, which has this famous verse, sometimes called the dominion verse, in which God is reported as granting humans dominion over the other animals, over all of them. And although that doesn't explicitly say what that dominion entails, it was interpreted, particularly under Christian thinking, as allowing us to do whatever we liked with them. And the other main root of Western thinking is the ancient Greek philosophy. And Aristotle had also a very hierarchical view that the less rational beings exist for the sake of the more rational beings. And so the brute beasts, as translated here, exist for us to have food and furs and various other things that we get from animals. So those views were brought together in Christianity, particularly by Thomas Aquinas, who had read Aristotle and also, of course, as a Christian had read Genesis, and he thought that they reinforced each other. And he went so far as to say that we're not answerable to God for what we do to animals. It doesn't really matter to God, and therefore not to us, what happens to animals. His only reason for thinking that cruelty to animals might be bad was that it might lead you to have a cruel disposition, and then you would be cruel to humans, which, on his view, would be bad. So that's how that view remained very influential in the Western tradition, really until the 20th century. In fact, that specific interpretation of dominion that Aquinas put forward was only officially rejected by the Roman Catholic Church about 10 years ago, when Pope Francis said that that was a misinterpretation of the dominion verse. Okay, whoops. The first real pushback, I think, against that view in Western thinking was from Jeremy Bentham, the founder of the utilitarian school of ethics, towards the end of the 18th century. And Bentham asked, said, I think he maybe was thinking of Immanuel Kant, who had suggested that also we don't have direct duties to animals because they're not autonomous beings. He said the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And I think that that's right, that to have moral status, to be a morally significant being, a being who it matters what we do to that being, I think you need to have the capacity for suffering or for enjoying life. Essentially, I'll refer to that as sentience. You can think of it as consciousness as well. But if you have that, then there is something that matters in itself about how we treat you, not only that it matters in terms of what you might then do to human beings. Okay, so from that, let's look at the principles that we might develop in place of speciesism, in place of this idea that we humans are the only ones who really matter, that we humans are the only ones with rights. How should we think about the moral status of animals? And in animal liberation, I argue for this position, this principle, which I call the principle of equal consideration of interests, or equal consideration of similar interests. And here's the principle as I stated: we ought to give equal weight to similar interests, irrespective of the species of the being whose interests they are. Now, the word similar interests is important here, because I'm not saying that the interests of non-human animals and of humans are the same in all respects. Obviously, you have an interest in learning about the ethics of the treatment of animals, or at least, understanding my viewpoint as you come along to this lecture. No non-human animal could have that interest because they wouldn't understand that. So there are differences, and in general, we're in an educational institution. In general, an interest in getting an education is something that humans have, certainly to a degree that non-human animals don't have. And there are many other interests that will differ according to the species of the animal. We, along with a lot of birds and mammals, have an interest in the welfare of our offspring. But, of course, there are some species of animals who lay eggs and do not take care of their offspring. So there are different interests that beings have. And we might think that some interests are important that animals don't have. So, for instance, we are very future-directed beings. We think about what we want to do in the future, not just in the immediate future. Some animals certainly think about short-term futures, but we can think about years ahead, as you might if you're an undergraduate just come to this university to start a degree. You're obviously thinking some years ahead of what you will do after you graduate. Animals don't have those kinds of interests. And so I think one could argue in that way or in other ways that the death of an animal is not the same kind of tragedy as the death of a human being, because it's not the thwarting of all future plans, or not of future plans of the same significance, length, intensity, importance in the life of the being, as is likely to be the case with a non-human animal. So this is not a principle of equal treatment. It's not to say that you must always treat animals and humans the same. It's rather that you must give weight to their similar interests. And you should not be saying, if there is both a human and a non-human animal in pain, you should not be saying, well, if the amounts of pain are similar, we should automatically try to prevent the pain the human is experiencing. That would be a speciesist bias. We should think about, maybe if the amounts of pain are exactly similar, there's nothing to choose, but if the amount of pain that the animal is suffering, if we believe that to be more severe than the pain that the human is suffering, and if we're only talking about the present pain, we're not talking about any long-term damage that will occur to the humans from the injury or wherever the human is suffering, then I think we should say we should try to prevent the greater amount of suffering, which in that hypothetical case will be the suffering of the non-human animal. Now, there are many other ethical traditions that have taken views on animals. I highlighted the Western tradition as the one that I know best, but there are certainly Eastern traditions which are, at least in principle, I would say, non-speciesist. Buddhism seems to advocate compassion for all sentient beings as one of its first principles, although it's an unfortunate fact that even in countries that regard themselves as Buddhist, if you go to Thailand, for example, if you go to Bhutan, you still find animals are not always being well treated. So I think there's a tendency for religions to be corrupted in human interests, and that certainly happens. Jainism is another ethical tradition that is based on non-violence and extends that non-violence to all animals. And then within the Western tradition and within contemporary philosophy, I talked about Bentham, who, as I said, was the founder of the utilitarian tradition. But it's interesting that in recent years, philosophers from several different traditions, including traditions of which you could say the founder was not at all sympathetic to the interests of animals and was clearly speciesist, those traditions have been interpreted in ways that are non-speciesist. So perhaps the leading contemporary Kantian ethicist is Christine Korsgaard, who's a professor at Harvard, and she published a book a few years ago called Fellow Creatures, saying Kant made a big mistake in thinking that we don't have direct duties to animals because they're not autonomous. And she develops a form of Kantianism that takes a different view. Carol Adams is a feminist ethicist, and several feminist ethicists are concerned about animals. In terms of Christian ethics, Charles Camosy is a Roman Catholic ethicist and theologian who wrote a book called For Love of Animals. I wouldn't say he's a complete non-speciesist, but he certainly agrees with many of my applications of the non-speciesist view. And I see that I left out here, I meant to mention Martha Nussbaum's Justice for Animals, which stems from an Aristotelian tradition, but is also taking a non-speciesist view. So I think that's encouraging, that you don't have to be a utilitarian to take a view that is, in its practical implications, is quite similar to what I'm arguing for. Okay, I'm now going to talk about three separate contemporary issues regarding animals, and I will start with companion animals. And just to make something local, here's a newspaper clipping about Singapore. Puppy mills, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, are places that breed animals for companion animals, often dogs, sometimes cats, for sale, and essentially without really any concern for the interests of the animals, the breeding animals, the mothers, are confined for all of their lives. Their role is just a breeding machine to pump out puppies. The puppies are not allowed to stay with their mother very long because the idea is that the mother should become pregnant again soon, and if the puppies are with her, she's less likely to become pregnant. So and they also are not, have no real human contact because there's en masse. So they give animals a really bad start in life, and that's why many people have the slogan, adopt, don't buy. If you want to have a companion animal, adopt one who might otherwise be astray or go to a shelter and might be killed. So that's one of several issues. There's a lot here are some of the issues that we could discuss if we had a lot more time about ethics of keeping companion animals. And one question is whether for a non-speciesist you should even have companion animals. My answer to that is if they're really like part of the family and you're really caring for their interests and giving them a good life, yes. But if they're just a kind of an ornament to you, a bit of fun occasionally, particularly let's say if you have a dog and you leave the dog at home all day while you're out at work or studying. Dogs are social animals. They're used to being in groups. And a solitary dog is probably not going to be a happy dog. There's the language. I use companion animal. I think it's more respectful to the animals than pet. They're sometimes abandoned. They're sometimes stolen. So there's a number of the issues here which show that we are not always applying, even with these animals who are obviously the most loved animals in our society, we are not always applying the principle of equal consideration of similar interests. Okay, so this is what you might do, why I'm starting with companion animals is to get you to think of your attitudes if you have companion animals, to think of your attitudes to animals and how you would like to see them treated, and whether you are prepared to extend that to other animals with whom you don't have a close personal relationship. Because although when I described speciesism earlier, I was talking about humans being dominant over other animals and favouring our human interests, there's another form of speciesism which perhaps is a little less significant, but that is the idea that we ought to be particularly kind to dogs and cats and maybe horses, animals that we have often some personal relationships with, but that this does not apply to other animals with whom we don't have those relationships, even if there's every reason to think that the capacities of those animals for suffering is very similar to those of the dogs and cats. So I would say don't be a speciesist even between species of animals. They should all have that consideration. Think about the effectiveness of your interventions to help animals. Think about the consequences of what you're doing. I'll talk about that in a little while too. And generally use your resources to do the most good you can for all sentient beings. Okay, the second issue that I'm going to talk about, which may be relevant to some of you here, depending on what you're studying, is the use of animals in research. Firstly, how many animals are used in research worldwide? It's surprisingly difficult to answer that question because only some countries keep accurate statistics. The European Union countries keep good statistics. The United Kingdom does. I think Australia and Canada do. The United States is particularly bad at that. Strangely, they keep some statistics on dogs, for example, on primates, but the vast majority of animals used in labs are rodents, rats and mice, and they don't keep any statistics on that. So that's one reason why we're kind of guessing about the number of animals used annually in research, but this best estimate from a 2019 paper is just under 200 million. If that was right 6 years ago, it could well be over 200 million now. And among the US has been a big user for a long time. China has greatly increased its animal use in recent years, and a number of other countries use quite large numbers too. So what about the regulations or controls of those animals? They also vary quite a lot across different countries. The European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, again, have stronger controls than most countries. They certainly have significantly stronger controls than the United States, and significantly stronger controls than China, the other leading country conducting animal experiments. And there's a lot of people think, well, experiments are done on animals in order to prevent cancer or other heart disease, other fatal diseases, or very disabling diseases. Certainly some experiments are done on animals to try to prevent or cure those diseases, but a very large number of experiments have nothing to do with conditions like that. There are still experiments being carried out on cosmetics, for example, testing cosmetics. Again, not in the European Union, they're prohibited in the European Union, but in many other countries. Pharmaceutical companies often attempt to produce a Me Too drug. That means if one of their competitors has a patent on a drug and that drug is selling very well, you could take Ozempic, I suppose, at the moment, other companies will try to produce something that is as good as Ozempic. Doesn't have to be better, they just want a share of that large market. And to do that, they will develop new compounds and they will test those compounds on animals who will be suffering by being forced to ingest large quantities of those drugs. So that's one example. And then there's a lot of experiments done in psychology on animals which are not going to translate into any benefits for humans. They're very remote connection with humans. They may add to knowledge of the psychology of those animals, but do they translate across to humans? Very often not. And in fact, the translation problem is also a general problem in things like drug testing too. And it's interesting that while I am very loath to say anything positive about the Trump administration or Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is appointed to head the Department of Health, but Kennedy has actually, or the Department of Health, the Food and Drug Administration and the National Institutes of Health have made quite strong statements recently about the waste of money that has gone into animal experiments that do not lead to any benefits for humans. They simply don't translate. One former head of the National Institutes of Health a few years ago said, we've got very good at curing cancer in mice, but it doesn't do anything for humans. Because the mechanisms are quite different. So they are now saying, at least, so far it's really words, but they are saying that they will develop more alternatives, including the use of AI to screen drugs. Okay, I want to talk now about a method of obtaining blood in research that is widely and commonly used in China. It's drawing blood from mice is done in many research procedures, monitoring how the blood how a drug, for example, is absorbed into the blood of animals, but it's a very common procedure. And this is an example, I think, of one of the largest users of animal in experiments having very weak regulations to prevent suffering. So this is a method known as eyeball enucleation, which essentially means removing the eyeball of a conscious mouse. And I'm going to show you a short video about that. The video is disturbing to watch, I think. So you may want to look away or cover your eyes. That's okay, but if you do that, and if you do find it unpleasant, just keep in mind what it was actually like for the mice to whom this is being done on quite a large scale and who are fully conscious before dying, and they do die during this procedure. I want to say as well that the video has a music background which is simply, how we found it. I want to credit Phi, who found it. How we found it on the internet. It's quite incongruous, and you can think about what that actually suggests about the attitude to what is being shown. Okay. Okay, at this point you can see the mouse is dead. Oops, sorry, I did not want to show it again. Okay, so I just to say it's unpleasant, but it happens, and is part of the attitudes that I'm talking about. I'm not saying that equally unpleasant things don't happen in other countries, but this is a video that is online as a teaching video. This is not like an undercover video that some activist obtained by breaking into a lab, as some of the videos that show you unpleasant things in other countries are going to be. If any of you, I don't know whether some of you are Chinese nationals here, but if any of you have any influence or will at future have some influence on practices in China, perhaps you'll think about that and consider whether it could somehow, the acceptability of that practice could be questioned and might eventually be changed. Okay, I now want to talk about factory farming, and this is really the big animal issue if we are concerned with reducing suffering and with the scale of what we're doing. As I said, the number of vertebrate animals killed annually in research worldwide is about 200 million, and you might think that's quite a lot of animals. Oh, sorry. But the number of vertebrate animals, just talking about vertebrate animals here, raised and killed annually in food production is around 200 billion. So it's 1,000 times larger. And I am talking about animals whose lives humans control from start to finish. So I'm not talking about wild-caught fish. If you included wild-caught fish, and if you included invertebrates as well, you would get to over 1 trillion non-human animals killed annually. But I'm concerned about this because it's not just the death of the animal, but it's the suffering involved. And also, I want to go back to what I said before about the importance of trying to use your resources effectively to reduce animal suffering. So here's a slide. This is based on American figures, but the box over here shows the number of animals used and killed each year in the United States, and color-coded. And you can see that farm animals take up almost the whole of that box. Right? We do have the laboratory animals as that sort of beige color there, and if you've got good eyes, you can see a little green stripe, which is the animals, the dogs and cats in shelters, and animals used for clothing, fur, for example. So that's the quantity of roughly, I would say, of suffering inflicted on animals. And this is where the money goes in terms of when people donate to animal charities. It overwhelmingly goes to the dogs and cats because, as I suggested, so many people are speciesist in thinking, oh, it's terrible that a dog should suffer or a cat, but I'm not really concerned about the suffering of chickens or pigs or cows. So all of that is the shelters. Then this is others, which a lot of them would be wildlife, I think, protecting wildlife or preserving wildlife. And the farm animals are just this little bit here, and the lab animals almost as much as the farm animals, although it's 1,000 times fewer. So this is why I think it's something that effective altruism groups and animal groups should be trying to change, to make sure that people understand that they're likely to reduce suffering much more by donating to organisations campaigning to reduce the number of animals in factory farms. And there are such organisations, and they have been quite effective in achieving that in various ways. Okay, so here are some of the things that we see if we look at factory farm conditions. These are stalls for the sows, the breeding sows, the mother pigs. I talked about the breeding dogs in the puppy mills. This is the factory farm equivalent of it, but it's again on a much larger scale. These stalls are a convenient way of keeping them. Convenient in the sense that it doesn't require much labour. You don't have to move. They don't move very much. They're pregnant, and they're just lying there during their pregnancy. They get fed once a day, and they stand up. They can lie down, but they can't actually turn around. They're too big to turn around in these narrow stalls. They can't even lie down without putting their legs under the bars, really stretching there. And they're on these uncomfortable metal slats. There's no bedding or straw or anything like that, because that would require labour to change the straw now and again, and some cost for bringing in the straw. Whereas this way you just hose it all down through the metal slats, and it flows out to a huge sort of cess pond outside the unit that all of these sows are in. So again, everything is done to make it as cheap as possible, and very little is thought about the welfare of the animals. And again, I made that comparison with dogs. It's not for nothing that George Orwell, if you've read Animal Farm, made the pigs the rulers of Animal Farm, because pigs are very smart animals, and you can test them in various ways. They're certainly comparable in intelligence to dogs. Okay, these are the pigs who are the offspring, the children of the ones I showed you before, the ones who are sent to market for ham, bacon and pork. And they're also indoors all their lives. They're also very crowded. They're not quite as confined as their mothers were. I've shown you this already. But this time I want to mention this quote from Professor John Webster, who was a professor of veterinary medicine and set up the largest centre for the study of farmed animal welfare in the United Kingdom at the University of Bristol, and one of the largest in Europe. Why does he say that this is the single most severe example of man's inhumanity to another sentient being? Well, you might say it's the numbers, that maybe has some part of it. It's the crowding. You can see how incredibly crowded these birds are. But there's another factor that you can't actually see. These birds have been genetically selected for extremely rapid growth, extremely fast growth. They want to eat all the time, and they put on weight very quickly. And the result is that the chickens that you see in the supermarket were killed at about 6 or 7 weeks of age. Whereas if you'd gone back, say when animal liberation first came out, it would have been at least twice as long before they reached the same weight and the same size. Now, they can put on weight fast, but their bones are still slow to mature. So what Webster has observed from his studies is that for at least the last 2 weeks of their 6-week life, they're actually in pain just bearing the weight of their bodies. Their legs struggle to support it, and in fact, in some cases, the legs collapse under them. And the other factor about having so little labour and trying to reduce costs is, suppose there's a bird here, suppose this bird's legs collapse under them, that means they can't walk to food or water. This is where these pipes are where the food and water comes down. And nobody is going to say, oh, here's a bird in trouble, I better put it out of its misery. That bird will simply die of dehydration or starvation. And it's accepted that even though these birds are only there for 6 weeks, and they're very young birds, that you're going to lose about 5% of each flock of birds that you put in. They're not going to make it for 6 weeks. And 5% might seem not that much, but if you think that the United States alone produces somewhere between 8 and 9 billion birds, chickens a year, well, take 5% of that, you're talking about quite a large number of birds. Okay, this is how eggs are standardly produced, at least not in the European Union, which has outlawed this kind of cage, and so has the United Kingdom, but it's still the majority form of production in the United States, and I would guess that the eggs that Singapore gets are probably also very commonly in these kinds of cages. So they're extremely crowded. This is a particularly, in the US, obviously, with little labour, they don't bother cleaning the droppings off the underlayer of cages; they just fall through. But it's all based on cost. It's all based on being able to keep the birds together, a little labour, and they're there in those cages for their entire laying life, which is usually a year, sometimes even 18 months. They never get out of those cages, then they only get out of them in order to be shipped away and killed. Here's another shot, closer up. So they can't really even spread their wings in a cage like that. Even if there were actually only one bird per cage rather than 4 or 5, they would not be able to fully stretch their wings. They also can't get away from the more aggressive birds, which will peck the weaker birds. So what they do to prevent the birds pecking each other to death is, if you look at this bird here, the beak is truncated. It doesn't have a sharp point on the end. So when they were chicks, the tips of their beaks were cut off with a hot blade, or sometimes now a laser is used. But it's a painful procedure. A beak is not like your fingernails. It's a sensitive organ with a lot of nerves for relating to the food. That's how a chicken in a farmyard will know whether it's picking up some grain or an insect or pebbles. So it's clear that inflicts pain that lasts for quite a long time. Okay, milk production has also gone intensive in a lot of places. We have these nice visions of cows grazing in the fields, but it's cheaper to bring them all indoors and to keep them indoors and to feed them on hay and other feeds. So a lot of cows don't get to roam in the fields anymore. And the other aspect of milk production that many people don't realize is that cows, like humans, do not produce milk unless they've recently given birth. And so in order to get milk from cows, you make the cow pregnant each year and you take the calf away within hours of birth. And that causes suffering for both the mother and the child. They're mammals. There's a strong bond between the mother and the calf. And dairy farmers will tell you that the cows will often call for their calves for days after they were taken away. Particularly in more traditional farming, if there was a particular place where the calf was removed and the cow, maybe in going out to the fields each morning and then coming back for the milking, passes that place, the cow may stop and call out for the calf for many days after the calf was removed. Okay, and then there's industrial fish production, which is like chicken production, extremely crowded, no concern for the individual welfare, just a commodity that is produced. All right, I don't want to go on for too much longer because I do want to give you some time for questions. But one of the key questions that we need to ask is which beings do matter? So where do we draw the boundaries of beings who have moral status? And one of the issues that I think there has been progress made on in the 50 years since Animal Liberation was published is about fish, because quite a few people denied that fish can feel pain in the 1970s and 80s. And really it was only in the last 25 years or so that good research was done on pain in fish. Particularly two women were the leading researchers. Victoria Braithwaite wrote this is a book, Do Fish Feel Pain? It's definitely worth reading. And her work was also done with and was followed up by Lynn Snedden, who's quoted here. And I think there's, I can go into details if you like. I think there's very clear evidence that fish do feel pain and are certainly suffering in those conditions that I just showed you at the fish farm, but also when they're caught in the ocean in various ways, they will feel pain and they will die slowly from suffocation mostly. So even if the fish has had a life unaffected by human intervention, unlike the farmed animals, the death is still going to be a painful one. Okay, going beyond vertebrates, this is at least the left-hand side of the screen, is the cover of an interesting report done by a group at the London School of Economics, headed by a philosopher, Jonathan Birch, but working with scientists in the relevant species. And they were reviewing the evidence of sentience in cephalopod mollusks, that's octopus like this, and squid, and decapod crustaceans, which are crabs and lobsters. And they concluded that there is a high probability of capacity to feel pain in those species. And actually that report, it's an interesting example of philosophers having a direct impact. That report influenced the British Parliament when it was passing legislation called the Animal Sentience Act. That occurred because the European Union had legislation, or actually was in the basic constitution, one of the basic framing bills of the European Union, was that animals have the status of sentient beings. They're not just things. They're not just property. Now, exactly what legal ramifications that has is not very clear yet. Hopefully in future it will be more significant. But when Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, wanted to take the country out of the European Union, a lot of animal welfare groups said, but then animals won't have the status of sentient beings in the UK. And Johnson, keen to win their support, said, don't worry, I'll bring in a bill to make an animal sentience bill so they will again have that status. And he actually did keep that particular promise, didn't keep them all. And the bill was introduced. And when it was going through the House of Lords, the question was raised, which animals are we talking about? Are we only talking about vertebrates? Because British cruelty to animal legislation had basically been concerned with vertebrates. And this report was shown and was discussed, and they included these categories of non-human animals in the Animal Sentience Bill. Okay, sorry, this I think I've already said everything in this slide. Yes. Okay, just very briefly now, let's look ahead. One issue that's relevant is what impact is AI going to have on animals? And together with Phi, we wrote, I think one of the seminal articles, a pioneering article. Phi was onto this very early. I want to say that he drew my attention to this issue, and we did research on it and published this article in 2023. And there is now a small field of work on AI and animals and its impact on animals. There have been 2 or 3 conferences, international conferences held on it, and there is other work being published in that area as well. And if you're interested in what is the impact, just to briefly mention 2. One is obviously AI controls autonomous vehicles, and therefore it will determine whether they will brake or swerve to avoid hitting animals on the road. So that's one very direct and obvious area. The less obvious one is that AI is increasingly being used in factory farms to regulate the conditions of the animals. So it's relevant how it's programmed and whether it's programmed to consider the interests of animals in these decisions. Another big question for the future is whether Asia will change and move away from factory farming or even have the kinds of regulations and protection that the European Union and the United Kingdom do. So there's a lot of factory farming going on in Asia now. Here are battery hens laying hens again in cages, and all Also in China, they're building enormous factory farms. China has more animals in factory farms than any other country in the world now, and that is, of course, not just the result of the large population size, but also the increase in prosperity of the population of China, which is a good thing, but it's a pity that they still have very poor regulations. So here is a Chinese pig farm. Again, these are the breeding sows. I'm not saying it's any worse than the other photo I showed you of breeding sows. It's probably rather cleaner, but it's much larger. You know, this, you can see the sort of the rows of sows go on, and this is in fact in a multi-story building. They're building 26-story buildings in China that are just full of pigs. They're just pig factories. So I think it's really important that we try and change attitudes in Asia. And finally, I want to say that if we are to set goals for the next 25 years, I think ending intensive animal production or factory farming should be a goal, and not only because of animal welfare, though that I think is very important because of the huge number of animals raised in factory farms and the vast amount of suffering it causes, but also it actually reduces the amount of food available to humans, because these animals in factory farms, obviously we have to grow food and bring it to them. They're not eating grass anymore. And so we're growing grains and soybeans mainly, and some fish meal is being used, so some fish are being caught, and we're feeding that to animals when we could be eating it, and the animals have to use a large portion. The majority of the food value goes into the animals as birds or mammals, keeping their bodies warm. That takes calories, developing bones and offal that we may not eat. So it's actually a very wasteful system. Factory farming increases greenhouse gas emissions. It increases the risks of pandemics, because if you saw those conditions I showed you, you can't imagine a better situation for a virus to spread and mutate than inside a crowded shed full of animals, where the animals are already somewhat stressed by the crowding and their immune systems are probably weak. So I think the animal movement's goal for the next 25 years at least should be to end it. You can support that goal by contributing to organizations that are effectively combating factory farming. You can also boycott its products, and whether you know, ideally you might become vegan or vegetarian, but if you find that difficult, then at a very minimum I would say find out where your animal products are coming and insist on getting animal products that do not come from factory farms, but come from animals who have minimally decent lives, or else do become vegetarian or vegan and refuse to eat it. Thanks very much for attending. I want to thank Fai again for his help with the slides, Faisal for helping to organize this, and the Center for Biomedical Ethics. We have some time for questions, so I'll look forward to receiving your questions.
Hello. Do the offsprings of these, if it's done over many generations, this farming of the animals, do they show some degeneration if they are bred like this through many generations?
Well, they are, as I said, they are selected for their productivity. So the chickens are selected to grow very fast. The pigs will also be selected for fast growth. Obviously, you know, they don't want strains that will be weak or not grow well under those conditions. So they are selecting strains that can physically survive the conditions. In that sense, they don't degenerate. Arguably, they have degenerated in terms of their ability to forage outside. You know, it's interesting. People sometimes take hens at the end of their laying period, for example, but they do actually manage to survive. It's quite surprising that the instincts they've never had a chance to exercise are there. So a hen will not only, you know, stretch her wings, she'll dust bathe. Hens, chickens out in the open, they find patches of dust and they fluff up dust under their wings. It's an instinct. Maybe it deals with parasites or something. Also, when it comes time to lay, they will try and build some sort of nest, you know, at least find some sort of sheltered place where they can lay the eggs, whereas they've been living in bare wire cages their entire lives. So no, those instincts basically survive.
Thank you very much for all you've done for 50 years. What about anthropomorphism? Because like if you look at children's books, there's lots of animals who kind of act like humans. Do you think that helps those children grow up to care more about animals or not?
I'm not sure specifically about portraying animals acting like humans. I think that is such a fiction that it probably doesn't do much good. But it is interesting, since you've raised the attitudes of children to animals, there are good studies that show that children are less speciesist in their attitudes than adults. For example, just I talked about AI and cars, and so there's been this huge moral online experiment called Moral Machines about where people have been asked to choose who a car should hit if the car is on the road and there's a child or an older person or a disabled person or somebody crossing against the red light. So there's a whole lot of judgments that we have about people's preferences. And if you control for age and talk about young children, they're actually more egalitarian in terms of thinking that it's just as bad for the car to hit an animal as it is to hit a human. And there are some very interesting videos. If you go and Google child refusing to eat meat, you get a series, and there's a number of videos of children who have sort of discovered recently that what they're eating is an animal, because they've been fed meat and they didn't realize that that is like, the animals in the books, maybe not the human talking ones, or they have soft toys about animals, and then they say, I don't want to eat animals. And you see the child and you see the mother talking to the child, and also the parents respond in different ways to that. But I think there's a sort of instinctive reaction to think positively about animals, which somehow gets, very often anyway, socially repressed, squeezed out of children.
Oh, I think you came first.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Singer. So my question is actually more related to lobbying towards policymakers. So when it comes to things like animal pain and suffering, I used to work in the policy space, and one of the dead ends that we tend to come around with would be, how can you be sure that these animals are experiencing that? Is it by inference? Or, because I've come across countless studies definitely showing this, but I think it's the communication piece that's really lacking. So I was just wondering if you would be able to share a little bit on your experience when it comes to policy reform related to animal welfare.
Yeah. So I think a lot depends in terms of where you can go on policy issues with where you are and what political system you're operating in. I would say, I perhaps already said this, policy reform for animals has been more effective in Europe than it has in the United States. And it's interesting that it's gone through, where it's been successful in Europe, it's just using pretty conventional parliamentary politics, that is trying to get some of the major parties to adopt better platforms for animals and then encouraging people to vote for those parties. In some European countries, there is actually a specific party for the animals where they have proportional representation for voting, and they have elected people to the Dutch National Parliament, for example. I think maybe the Spanish National Parliament as well. And the European Parliament has also passed regulations favouring animals. So that lobbying seems to have worked quite well. In the United States, it's not worked, hardly worked at all to go, especially at the federal level. There's very weak laws. There are no federal laws in the United States about how you can keep animals in factory farms. In contrast to the entire European Union, which has set space allowances and says they must be able to move around. That has only happened in the United States in a few states, and even there, it's mostly not happened through the state legislature, but because those are the states where citizens can bring an initiative. If you gather a lot of signatures, then a proposed law will go on the ballot and people can vote for it. And that's happened in California and a couple of other states, and they have more advanced laws, more like the European laws. And that's because they get quite large majorities. A law in Massachusetts got 78%, which is, in such a polarized country as the United States, is pretty unheard of to find anything that 78% of people support. But the fact that they can't get it through the legislatures, I think, is because money plays such a big role, and the agribusiness lobby is a huge lobby, and so has the research lobby been up to now too. So I think you have to try to get the message across. You have to try to influence voters, of course. I think there is a natural, as those US votes show, there is a natural sympathy for animals if you can avoid the lobbying influence.
Hi, you're just asking this out. Thank you for the talk. I'm just asking this out of curiosity. But like, what would you say about the consumption of insects? Because I understand that recently we've been trying to turn insects like mealworms and crickets into meals and extra nutrients for us. And you could possibly replace like animal suffering. But if you consider insects as animals also, then where would that stand? Like, where would you stand?
Yeah. You're right. There's a lot of insect production going on now. In fact, the majority of it is not for direct human consumption. That's also being used as an animal feed. You mentioned mealworms. I think black soldier fly larvae is a popular one. I think that there's, we can't be certain, but there's a reasonable probability that insects can also feel pain. Certainly we can't exclude that. And if we can't exclude it, and the numbers are very large as they are, they're in the trillions for the numbers of insects being produced now in intensive conditions. And if it's likely that they will suffer, given the conditions they're in, which we don't necessarily know, because yes, they may be incredibly crowded, but then some insects don't seem to mind being crowded. I think it would be better to avoid it because of the risk that they have some consciousness, and even if the consciousness is less than ours, if there are so many of them, I think would be better not to use them. But that's a sort of ongoing discussion. I don't have a permanent view. It would be good if we could learn more about their consciousness. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, you there first? Okay.
Thank you for the talk. I was just wondering, as developed countries sort of get richer, there's a bigger social trend towards dual income, no-kid families, and they very often have companion animals serve as sort of proxy for children. So what do you think about this particular trend? Is it problematic, or is it the fact that they're generally caring quite deeply for them that is good?
I don't think it's particularly problematic from an animal welfare, animal ethics perspective. I think generally they do care well for those animals. There certainly are such trends. I think the interesting moral question about this is what we think about a falling global population. And although the population will still rise until at least 2080, most predictions suggest that it will start to fall after that. And there's an interesting book by Dean Spears called what is it? After the Peak, I think, something like that. And he writes about whether this is a bad thing that we should be trying to do something about to encourage people to continue to have children. Now, you might say, well, at the moment, the environmental problem, the greenhouse gas problem, means the more children you have, the worse that will get. But Dean Spears' argument is that, in fact, yes, we should have done something about climate change 50 years ago, but it's now a little late. It's not a reason anymore for not having children, because by the time those children grow up, we will be starting to peak anyway. We've got to do something about greenhouse gases before that. So I think that's an interesting issue that probably needs more discussion. But from the animal welfare point of view, I don't object to it. Yep.
Good evening. So first of all, thank you so much for this session, which is not about the health and the environmental benefits of animal agriculture, because usually those are the topics which are more popular. And this is a place where we can talk about morality. So of course, being vegan is the most effective step that you can take towards reducing animal suffering. But if you go a little a layer deeper, what confuses me, this is a personal problem, that when it comes to wild animals, when it comes to helping rescue wild animals, what confuses me is that if I put my efforts to, for example, rescue a python, the python is going to eat up more animals. So I don't know whether I should rescue the animal, because then I feel, oh, I'm being a speciesist, so I'm completely confused and I just don't do anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's the area of the ethics of how we treat wild animals is one that philosophers have started to discuss. That's another difference. Nobody was talking about that. You know, I'm talking about from the animal welfare perspective, as the perspective you were talking about. Nobody was talking about that in the 70s or 80s. It's really only in this century that people have started talking about it, and there's some interesting discussion about that. There's a couple of books being written. Katia Ferrier has written a book called Ethics in the Wild, I think. So I would think, you know, I mean, you may have an independent value of preserving endangered species. So I don't know if the python that you're rescuing is of an endangered species. That might be a reason for rescuing it, even though the python is a carnivore. But if not, then, you know, some people certainly would argue that you ought not to be helping the carnivores. But that's only one of the problems that people talk about in terms of wild animal suffering. Some of them are concerned about the methods of reproduction that some species have. You know, frogs, for example, will produce hundreds or even thousands of offspring, of tadpoles, and the vast majority of them will die very young, because, you know, that's why we're not walking knee-deep through frogs. They have to die. You know, it has to be basically each pair of frogs produces 2 or at the most 2.1 or something offspring. So are they suffering when they die? Is that something we should worry about? And, you know, should we intervene? I think that's a future issue. That's why I'm focusing on the things that are here and now. But there are a whole interesting nest of questions, of which you raised one, about how we should relate to wild animals.
Okay, this is as much time as we have for the venue, so please join me in thanking Professor Singer again.